Welcome to our special bonus webinar where you get to come to visit my home organization, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, or as we like to call it, WHOI. My name is Grace Simpkins, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This bonus WHOI Live webinar concludes a series sponsored by NOAA's Regional Collaboration Network and Woods Hole Sea Grant, where I work, which is located at WHOI here on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Now, don't forget to visit the NOAA Live website to sign up for a NOAA Live Iron-On patch if you haven't already gotten one, if you're one of our viewers, to commemorate our learning time together. And you can also go there to find resources about what you're going to learn today. So all of the species that you're going to hear about from Lindsey, you can find out more at our website. All right, today I'm going to be introducing you to one of our amazing researchers here at WHOI, Lyndsey Lefebvre. She's going to take us on an exploration of the ocean twilight zone. Now, while we'll be talking about the ocean twilight zone and the strange and wonderful creatures of the deep, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional land of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We are hosting this webinar from the ancestral lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Hetapwina. I also want to extend special thanks to our American Sign Language interpreters for the whole season, but in particular, today we have Crystal Butler and Trisha Vasquez. A few guidelines before I hand you over to Lindsey. You are all muted. However, the box where you wrote where you're from, please make sure you write your questions. We'll be asking you questions, but we also want you to ask us questions. I'll be keeping track of them for Lindsey. I'll ask her as many as we can during the webinar, and she'll try to get to as many as she can. Okay, I know that you're probably done hearing me talk, and I want to learn all about the ocean twilight zone and the amazing creatures. So at this point, I'm going to turn you over to Lindsey. So Lindsey, they are all yours.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Grace. I'm really excited to be talking to you from here in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Just like Grace said, I'm kind of just down the road from her. So this is Cape Cod out here in Massachusetts. Now, I am really excited to be talking to you today about an amazing and mysterious part of the ocean that I am very fortunate to currently be studying. I've always been interested in the ocean. I joke and say that the ocean is just in my blood. My dad was a captain on a cargo ship, and so I've always had a connection to the ocean, even though I grew up in the deserts of northern Nevada. And this is me, my first time going to sea when I was 14 years old on my dad's ship in the Gulf of Alaska. Now, I'm a biologist, so I study life in the ocean. And in particular, I study fish. And I became really interested in fish in college when I started scuba diving. And in the kelp forest off of Central California, I just became fascinated with the behaviors and the biology of fish, of going through the kelp forest and being able to see that fish at the surface were behaving very differently from fish down at the bottom. And it just really drove my curiosity. I came to WHOI in 2020 to join Joel Yokes' lab. He's a fish ecologist working on the Ocean Twilight Zone project that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So this is a project that was started in 2018. It's funded by TED Audacious. And this is, this is really a really large project that involves scientists from all sorts of disciplines. There are biologists and chemists and oceanographers as well as engineers all coming together to try and explore a part of the world that we still don't know a lot about. So first off, I'm going to kind of talk to you about what the Twilight Zone is. I'm going to introduce you to a cast of characters that live in the Twilight Zone. Then we'll talk about how we might study the animals that live in the Twilight Zone, as well as discuss why all of us sitting here right now are affected by the Twilight Zone. So to get started, I would love if you could throw some guesses into the chat box about what the Ocean Twilight Zone is, if anybody has guesses or knows already.
All right, this is Grace from the chat box. So Lindsay's question is, what is the ocean twilight zone? Or do you know anything about the ocean twilight zone? So please go ahead and write that in that box so that I can let her know what everyone's thinking. So what I like to do is break it down. So think about the three pieces: ocean, twilight, and zone. Those are all big hints. Okay, so we've got Garrett saying it is in the middle depth of the ocean. Laura is saying it's the bottom zone of the ocean. Azul is saying where the beings that live there make their own light. And Texas thinks maybe it's 600 feet below. Donna thinks the area below the well-lit surface area. Some people think sort of a middle. Sloan thinks it's the zone right before the midnight zone. And Casey, last one, it's deep in the ocean where it's pretty dark. So those are some good guesses. I'll stop there. Back to you, Lindsey.
All right, those are some really fantastic guesses, and you guys already seem to know a little bit about this zone. So the ocean twilight zone is a huge habitat. It covers nearly two-thirds of the world's two-thirds of the world here. So any place on this map that you see blue, there's ocean twilight zone habitat. You are A lot of people were saying that it's this middle portion of the ocean, and that's right. So it is located about 200 meters below the surface of the water, which is about the length of 2 football fields. Now, it's an area of water that's about a half-mile thick, and a half-mile is the equivalent to 2 Empire State Buildings being stacked on top of each other. So stretching around the world, being half-mile thick, it's a huge, huge area of our ocean. Because it's so deep, it also has a lot of pressure. Animals that live down there experience a lot of pressure. We wouldn't be able to dive down there by ourselves without being in, a special vehicle to get down there. Just as an example, this is a styrofoam cup, a regular styrofoam cup that was attached to some of our instruments and went down to the Twilight Zone. Just a little dinky thing now. Also, because it's so deep, it's also really cold. So the temperature down there can get to be about 40 degrees Celsius, or Fahrenheit, which is the same temperature as your refrigerator. So while we really use depth to kind of simplify talking about the twilight zone, this is really an area that is defined by the amount of light that reaches there. So I heard some wonderful guesses talking about it's an area where there's just a little bit of light coming through. So there's some sunlight trickling through, but not enough for photosynthesis to occur. Now, to me, one of the most amazing things about the twilight zone is that the world's largest migration occurs in this part of the ocean every single day. So animals that live down here in the twilight zone during the daytime will come up towards the surface at night, and then as the sun sets, they will dive back down to depth. Now,
I'm sorry, Lindsey. You said as the sun sets, but I think you mean as
as the sun rises. I'm so sorry about that. Yes, as the sun rises, the animals dive back down to depth. Now, we said before that this is a dark part of the ocean. Photosynthesis doesn't happen here. So are there any guesses as to why these animals might migrate?
Okay, this is Grace from the chat box, and this is a really interesting question. So I'm eager to see what everybody thinks. So why are these animals migrating? Why are they staying down deep during the day, but coming up to the surface at night? And Texas says, well, you know what? I'm going to give everyone 5 seconds to put their answers in before I read you some of them. I don't want to give anything away. Okay, we've got quite a few answers now. So Texas and Garrett think that it's to get food. Alice and Chris maybe think to avoid predators. Laura says maybe they just don't like the light. Garrett thinks it's more safe. Casey thinks maybe it's temperature related. Does it have something to do with temperature? Michelle also agrees maybe they're hiding from predators, as does Donna. So they think that maybe they're hiding from the predators during the day, and that's why they're going up and feeding at night. Azul thinks maybe they can move easier because of the darkening sky. Maybe that has something to do with them being able to it easier to get to the surface. So I'm going to stop there. I think those are most of our answers, and turn it back to you, Lindsey.
Fantastic. So those are some really interesting answers there. So they are indeed one of the main reasons why they're coming up into these near surface waters at nighttime is to feed. So we call this a diel vertical migration. So daily is diel, vertical up and down and migration. And they're doing this because just like on land, the base of most food webs are plants. In the ocean, the base of most food webs are tiny microscopic phytoplankton that are floating in the surface of the waters. And because photosynthesis doesn't occur down deep in the twilight zone, those phytoplankton are located up here in the surface. And again, you guys had it right. They dive down deep when the sun is out to avoid predation by visual predators that can come and get them. Now, in this picture, we do see some animals like the sperm whale here, as well as some swordfish right here that are diving down and actually feeding on them. But we'll talk a little bit about that too. So I'm going to take a pause right here before we start talking about more of the critters that live down in the twilight zone and take any questions that may have come up.
Okay, this is Grace in the chat box. Thank you, Lindsey, for stopping. As I told you, we always have a very inquisitive bunch, so we always have questions coming in. So one of the questions that came in, and this is going to lead into what you're going to talk to us about, I think, is Sarah's wondering, do you find dolphins in the twilight zone?
Oh, that's a great question. So there are dolphins, a species in particular that we know dives down into the twilight zone are called Rizzo's dolphins. And dolphins are marine mammals, so they're air breathers. So they can't stay down in the twilight zone for a super long period of time, but they do dive down there to feed on some of the animals that live in the twilight zone.
And I apologize if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but Turingi is wondering, how can they perform photosynthesis at nighttime since it requires sunlight?
That's a great question. So the photosynthesis actually isn't happening during the nighttime. Photosynthesis is occurring during the daytime, but the phytoplankton are still in the surface waters. And so the twilight zone animals are taking advantage of the fact that it's dark and going up there to eat all the animals that have performed photosynthesis during the day, or sorry, all the plants that have performed photosynthesis during the day.
And just for those children out there that might not know, I just wanted to let you know, photosynthesis is the process that green plants or some other organisms like phytoplankton, they use sunlight and carbon dioxide and water to make food that then can be eaten by other things. So Lindsey, sorry, I just, in case there's anybody that doesn't know that word, that's what's happening. So let's see, here's a question from Sloan that has to do with sperm whales, but I'm going to just tell you, Sloan, that your question, I'm going to ask Lindsey, but I'm going to encourage you to look it up because it's very detailed about sperm whales, and she and I are not sperm whale experts. So Lindsey, if you can answer it, go ahead, but if you can't, we're going to challenge Sloan to look up the answer. Do male sperm whales have a larger sonic boom than do males have a larger one than a female?
That's a good question. I'm going to tell you that this is a great opportunity for you to look that up and let us know.
Yes, we're going to turn that back on you, Sloan. So let us know if you find out, but that's something that we encourage you to go research. Okay, so this question comes from Tyler. Is there some light in the ocean twilight zone? Can the creatures there tell when it's day versus night?
That's a really excellent question. So we call it the twilight zone. Twilight during the day, or on land, is the time of day when the sun has set, but there's still a little bit of light trickling around. It's not completely dark yet, and same with the twilight zone in the ocean. So there is some sunlight there, and some animals that live in the twilight zone actually have enough sensitivity to that light that even if there's a storm coming through and the sky gets really dark, they might actually start the migration even though it's not really nighttime.
Great. Okay, I'm going to hold on to the rest of the questions, but I will remind you, I'm keeping track. So write questions as they come to you, and I'll ask them when Lindsey takes a break. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back to you, Lindsey.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's start talking about some of the animals that live in the Twilight Zone. And what we're going to be talking a lot about are the adaptations that they have for living in the Twilight Zone. Now, an adaptation is a physical trait that helps an animal survive. So we were kind of talking about sperm whales. This is my little right whale here. And an adaptation that a marine mammal has for being an air-breathing, ocean-dwelling animal are blowholes on top of his head. And so that essentially means that its nose has kind of shifted to be on top of its head. And that makes it easier to come up, take a breath, and then dive back down with kind of minimal effort. So the animals that we're going to be looking at in the Twilight Zone have a lot of special adaptations to be able to live in an environment that's so deep, so cold, and has a lot of pressure as well. So taking a look at some of these ocean Twilight Zone animals, can anybody list some adaptations that they think these animals might have?
Okay, this is Grace from the chat box, and this is a fun one. So take a look at all of those unique things that Lindsay's put up there and let me know, do you see any adaptations? And just remember, those adaptations might be to the fact that they're living somewhere that's cold or that has low light or high pressure. So what do you notice? All right, so Texas says it looks like there are big eyes. Garrett says maybe bioluminescence, as well as Mylon says the same thing. Michelle thinks that the color is an adaptation. Dean also thinks that bioluminescence. All right, any other guesses before I turn? Oh, so someone noticed the sharp teeth. Garrett sees those. Azul says glowing skin, large eyes. Maybe they have lights inside of them. So I think that's a pretty good list, Lindsay. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was really great. And you guys touched on a lot of things that we're going to be talking about today. So these adaptations that I'm going to be talking about, I already kind of gave you a preview of one of the ones that's the first one we're going to be talking about. We might consider these adaptations as superpowers that really allow these animals to take advantage of this vast habitat that they live in. Now, one of the most obvious difficulties about living in the Twilight Zone is that there isn't a lot of light. And a lot of you touched on the fact that a lot of animals that live in the Twilight Zone can actually produce their own light. So, for example, if you're out camping with your family and you get hungry in the middle of the night, it's really dark, you might grab a flashlight and use this to help you find your food. And so that's one way that animals that live in the Twilight Zone can use light. And so animals producing their own light is something we call bioluminescence. And this is an animal that maybe if you're familiar with any Twilight Zone animal, might be this one. This is called an anglerfish of Finding Nemo fame. And the way that this animal uses bioluminescence is it has kind of this fishing pole located on top of its head that it can move back and forth. And it has this little bioluminescent lure on the end called an esca that it can move all around or even just hold in front of its mouth and kind of wait for its prey to come to it. So kind of a passive way to eat, but a really effective way to attract prey to yourself. Now, one thing I want to point out, because a lot of people are surprised at the size of these Twilight Zone animals. If I saw a fish like this that was the size of a great white shark, I would choose the great white shark any day of the week, no problem. However, I'm going to show you right here, let's get you into the light, is an anglerfish. So this is a female anglerfish called a black sea devil, and you can see that it's really about the size of my thumbnail. So not quite so big and ferocious, but small but still mighty. So these animals can use bioluminescence to hunt, but they can also use it to communicate as well. So the next animal that I'm going to show you is called an Atolla jellyfish. And I want you to watch this video. And once you see it start to bioluminesce, I want you to throw in some ideas into the chat box about what this bioluminescent pattern looks like to you.
All right, this is Grace from the chat box. What does that pattern look like to you? I know what it looks like to me, but I want to hear what it looks like to you. Azul, I agree. It looks a little bit like a spaceship. Laura thinks maybe stars. Garrett says it looks like it's a circle, and Casey expands on that, that it looks like it's a spiral. And Texas thinks it actually looks like an eye. So I
All
think
right.
back to you.
Yeah, definitely. I can see all of those, the UFO for sure. To me, it also kind of looks like a police siren. So another name for the Atolla jellyfish is the alarm jelly. So it could be that this animal is sending a warning to others that predators might be nearby. It might be trying to distract and startle predators. Another way that animals can use bioluminescence is to kind of spew out a cloud of bioluminescent material, like an octopus spewing ink to try and get away. So we've talked about using bioluminescence to hunt. We've talked about using it to communicate, but now I'm going to be talking a little bit about using bioluminescence to hide, which kind of sounds funny, I know. This is a prey species called a lanternfish. And lanternfish have these rows of photophores, which is cells where bioluminescence occurs. And these patterns that they have of photophores on their belly, if you were to be below it and looking up, it might look something like this. So lighting up your belly to blend in, I know sounds really weird and counterintuitive, but remember that there is still a little bit of light coming down from the surface. And so a predator looking at this fish from below would still see a shadow that that fish was casting. But when they light up their bellies, they can blend into the background a little bit more. And fish like this lanternfish are actually able to adjust both the color as well as the brightness to help blend into their background a little bit better. And right now, before we keep on going, I'll take a pause for any questions that may have come up.
Okay, this is Grace from the chat box. Don't forget to write your questions in. And I have to say, Lindsey, that you just showed my favorite fish, the anglerfish with its own fishing pole, is very, very cool. So this question comes from Tyler, and Tyler's just wondering, are the fish producing the bioluminescence themselves?
That's a really great question. So there are some fish that are able to produce the bioluminescence themselves. It's a chemical reaction that occurs within specialized cells in their bodies. So the myctophids are some of the fish, those lanternfish can produce light on their own. The anglerfish and some others as well actually have we call it a symbiotic bacteria. So a bacteria that is really the thing that's producing the bioluminescence, but it hides in a special organ inside the animal. So it kind of happens both ways.
Yeah, I think having a sack of bioluminescent bacteria is just a really neat adaptation.
Yeah.
So Garrett wonders, why do they need to be so small?
So that's a really good question. Part of it is that even though the Twilight Zone is a really huge habitat, and there are a lot of animals that live in it, it's estimated that there might be more fish in the Twilight Zone than the entire rest of the ocean. But because it's so huge, they're also really spread out. So part of the reason is that, this is kind of a food limited habitat. But there's
Great.
more that we're, trying to find out about the Twilight Zone and, why these animals are the way they are too.
So I have to tell you, I think it's amazing. And Lindsey is like one of the explorers of old. They don't know a lot and are learning constantly. I know that every time I hear from Lindsey and her crew, I learn new things that they've learned new. So it's pretty exciting what you do, Lindsey, I have to say.
Yeah, we think so too.
Okay, Laura has a question. Are all bioluminescent fish the same color?
That's a really good question. So most of the bioluminescence that I'm aware of tends to be blue. And we'll talk about, coming up, we'll actually talk about why that light tends to be blue rather than other colors.
Okay, one last question. Michelle's wondering, do some of the fish change their color at depth. So can they change their skin color?
So there are some animals, like there are squids and octopus. I don't know if maybe you've seen some videos of shallower water animals that can change. It's called chromatophores, are the cells that are able to kind of change the skin of different animals. And so there are definitely some primarily invertebrates that are able to change their skin color.
Great. Okay, I'm going to save all the rest of the questions and I'm going to turn it back to you, Lindsey.
Okay, great. So we've talked about using light to warn or to attract or kind of even to hide, but now we're going to talk about another way to hide in the Twilight Zone. And so this is kind of a passive superpower, but I think it's a really mighty one, and that's the power of invisibility. So this is an anglerfish and what it might look like with just the bioluminescent ESCA when you're down in the deep, deep, dark sea. So let's talk a little bit about the way that light works in the ocean. So the light that we see coming from the sunlight is actually composed of all the colors of the rainbow. So you might remember Roy G. Biv. Now, each color light has different properties, and that affects how deep that color light travels in the ocean. So red light gets absorbed really quickly and doesn't penetrate much past the surface, but blue light travels really, really far, and it travels the farthest of any of the colors of light. Now, we perceive an object to be a particular color because that color light reflects off of that object. So for example, this is a blue tang here, a dory fish, and it looks blue to us because the blue light is bouncing off and reflecting back to our eye. So this is another opportunity that I want you guys to think about. Red light does not travel very far. Blue light goes really deep. So what might some of the colors of the animal Twilight Zone critters be? What might be some great colors for them to be?
Okay, this is Grace from the chat box. Here's your chance to tell us, what color do you think most of the animals in the ocean Twilight Zone are? We've got a couple of guesses. I'm going to just wait for a second and let people write them in because I don't want to give it away what everyone's thinking. Okay, you have about 5 more seconds to tell me what color you think they are, and then I'm going to read them out. Okay, so we've got Chris and Texas and Michelle are thinking red. We've got Mylon, Sloan, Garrett, Azul, Laura thinking blue. And then we've got Sloan is also hedging and saying green as well. And Mylon is saying green. And Dean is saying gray or clear. So I love it. We've got some guesses across the range. So I'm going to hand it back to you to tell us, Lindsey, or show us, I guess.
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, you guys were hitting on it, and so gray, I don't have a gray critter, but this is a little black critter, and I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer to my simulated ocean Twilight Zone box that I've got over here. So this is a black dragonfish. If I were to put it into the Twilight Zone, you could see black obviously kind of fades away pretty quickly. But now let's check on some of these colors that we were talking about. I heard somebody say red. So this is a red shrimp that lives down in the Twilight Zone. And I have a piece of blue filter paper here. What this is going to do is take away all the other colors of light except for the blue light. So let's see what happens if this were a shrimp that were way down in the Twilight Zone where only blue light was reaching that area. So when we put that blue filter up, the shrimp really disappears and we really can't see it. Now, let's see what happens to our blue tang, which is a coral reef fish. Let's see what happens if she gets lost down in the Twilight Zone. So unfortunately, Dory here is standing out pretty strongly against the background. So red is a really effective way to hide, and it really makes these animals become almost invisible. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of other critters that live in the colors that they use. So this is an animal called a strawberry squid, and it's one of the most photogenic animals in the Twilight Zone. So I had to take a minute to show you this picture. And I have one here in a jar too. So You can see its red skin. So that definitely helps it blend in. In this picture too, it might be kind of hard to see, but there are little blue dots on it that are bioluminescent. So the reason why bioluminescence is blue is because blue light is visible down in the depth, and so that is a way that animals can actually communicate with each other, because a lot of them can still see that light, whereas they can't see red. Somebody had said that clear or translucent might be a good color to be as well. So these are a bunch of tiny little krill that you can see are mostly translucent, mostly clear, but have a little bit of red to hide too. Now, the last superpower that I'm going to cover today is talking about how these animals eat. So in the Twilight Zone, a lot of the animals that live down there we consider super hunters. As I mentioned before, it's a large area, and even though there are a lot of animals living down there, they're so spread out that you never really know when your next meal is coming to you. And so a lot of these animals are able to really have some special adaptations that help them take advantage of eating whatever they come across. This is a fish called a black swallower, and you can see an adaptation that it has is this really large mouth with jaws that unhinge. And so this animal is able to eat really, really large organisms, and with an expanding stomach as well, it can eat animals that are even larger than itself. Another example of these large jaws come on this fish called a pelican eel. And so what you can see here are, again, the really, really big, large jaws, a mouth that opens up really, really wide, and then this mouth that also really expands into a balloon. So it can gulp up a big ball of krill that might be floating down in the bottom in the Twilight Zone. It can also feed on octopus or squid that might even be larger than itself. So eating something bigger than yourself is kind of a theme with a lot of these animals. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet are ways to maybe capture these prey with something like really large, ginormous teeth. And so these two fish show this adaptation of having really large teeth as well. This animal up here, this fish, is called a fang tooth, and this fish down here is called a viper fish. And so those names even sound kind of creepy and tell you a little bit of something about, about their teeth and kind of their dominant features. Now, these fish can use their teeth to grasp onto prey, but you can imagine, especially, I think the viper fish down here is a good example of this. You can imagine that for a fish like a viper fish that can unhinge its jaw to 90 degrees and has these big, sharp, pointy fangs, when they close their mouth around a potential prey item, even if they haven't skewered it, their teeth act like a cage to help contain it so it can then swallow it. Now, kind of another random fun fact about the viper fish is that it can eat something 60% larger than itself. And so that's kind of like you being able to swallow your mom or dad whole, which is kind of a weird and kind of crazy thing that these animals are able to do. Now, super hunters don't have to just have teeth or enormous jaws. This is actually an invertebrate, a gelatinous invertebrate called a salp. And they form these really large colonies where they all join together, and they're considered the vacuums of the sea because they float around in the ocean, filtering the water and collecting phytoplankton and the zooplankton, which are microscopic animals that live in the ocean. And something we don't really get to talk about in science class very much is poop, but the poop of these animals is really, really important. So it is really carbon dense. And so when these animals eat a lot, they poop a lot, and that poop can sink really far down into the ocean and take, they're a great way to get carbon that's up at the surface down to the bottom of the ocean. And we'll talk later about why that's so important and how that actually helps keep our planet cool. And so right now I'll pause before we start talking about how we study the Twilight Zone.
Great. This is Grace in the chat box. I have a couple of questions for you, Lindsey.
Yep.
Mylon is wondering, how big is the viper fish?
Oh, so the viper fish, actually have a sample right here. So viperfish get to be, this is kind of one of the larger ones at about, I guess this guy is about 10 inches.
Excellent. So they're a little bit bigger than the ones we've seen before. So I'm glad that you asked that, Mylon. Okay, this question comes from Nicole. The animals with the big mouth, do they then have a big throat and a big stomach, or do they do digestion in their mouth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this viperfish that we were just talking about can actually expand its stomach. So they aren't doing the digestion in their mouth, they are swallowing it. And so their stomachs can actually expand for the digestion. At least that's what we believe.
Well, and so this leads into Tony's question. And Tony was wondering, after eating something really large, does it weigh the animal down? Do they have to like rest to eat, to digest?
You know, that's a question that I don't know that we really have an answer for, but you can imagine that I can imagine that, you know, taking a big meal, you're probably going to try and conserve energy as your body's digesting that.
Great. And Paige is wondering if those samples that you're showing us are living.
So the samples that I am showing you are not living. There's samples that we've collected to be able to find out more information about them. So the animals don't survive too well when we bring them up from the Twilight Zone.
And this last question before I let you move on comes from Sarah. And Sarah's wondering, what's your favorite Ocean Twilight Zone animal and adaptation?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I'm going to show you really quickly. So what I study as far as fish goes is reproduction, and so I'm really interested in how these fish reproduce and the different reproductive strategies that they have. So this is a fish called a lancet fish, and I think it's really neat because this is a fish that is both male and female at the same time. And so they're really doubling their chances at finding a mate in the Twilight Zone. And it's a pretty unique adaptation that we don't see in a lot of fish or vertebrates at all. So it's pretty cool to me.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to hold on to the rest of the questions because I know you have a lot of really fun things to still share with us, and turn it back to you, Lindsey.
All right. So the Twilight Zone is a really tough place to live. We've kind of talked about that, but it's also a really tough place to do research. So for most places, you have to go really far away from land to be able to get to water that's deep enough to access the Twilight Zone habitat. So for example, this is one of WHOI's ships called the research vessel, the Neil Armstrong. And going out, it can take about 9 to 12 hours to get to our Twilight Zone sampling site, which is, you know, a pretty long distance. And once we're out there, we are really doing a lot of work. So scientists talk about taking cruises, but you know, a scientific cruise is not what you think of when you hear that word. So it's not lounging around on the deck all day, but we're really, as soon as we get out there, we start collecting data. And it's really 24 hours a day that there are nets or instruments in the water so that we can take advantage of the time that's out there. Now, I want to hear some guesses about ways that you think scientists can study the Twilight Zone. So how do we learn more about these animals? How do we see them? How do we get to experience them?
Okay, this is Grace from the chat box, and this is a great question for you all to put your thinking caps on, because we said the Ocean Twilight Zone, if I remember correctly, is like 2 football fields down below the surface. So how do we study them? What do we use? All right, someone is familiar with WHOI because Garrett is saying Alvin. Texas is saying that we use ROVs, so remotely operated vehicles. Sloan is saying maybe underwater cameras and submarines like the Alvin. Carol is saying maybe BAF LiDAR developed from NASA. Dean and Michelle are both agreeing that they think ROVs are some of the things we use. So, any other guesses that are coming in? Because there are a few more. All right. So I think we're going to learn a few things from Lindsey, because I know I did when she first told me how they're doing all their research. So back to you, Lindsey.
All right, fantastic. So a lot of the ways that you mentioned are definitely ways that we study the ocean twilight zone. And I'm going to take you to kind of, one of the most basic ways that you might think about studying animals is using a net to collect them. And so we use nets, but we're really interested in where the fish in the twilight zone are coming from. So if we just use a regular net and tow it through the water, we don't know if the animals were collected at the surface, at the bottom, or somewhere in between. And so we use this special net called the mock nets. And this has 10 different nets on it that we can open and close at different depths. So that way, any animal that's in that net, we know exactly where in the water it was collected. And then we can also get an estimate of how many animals are in a particular volume of water. So how many animals did we collect through the area that we towed in? And now the other thing with nets, though, as you can imagine, is that some animals might be able to swim away from them. Some animals might be so small that they escape through the holes and never get caught. And in the twilight zone, there are a lot of delicate and gelatinous organisms. And so if you can imagine, if a piece of jello went into a net and we pulled it up, the jello might squish out the back. And so you might not know it was ever there, or if it came up, it might be so damaged that you really wouldn't be able to know what it was and see the details of what it was. So things like submersibles, like Alvin, somebody had mentioned, are really, really cool ways to be able to get down and see the twilight zone. This is a picture of Heidi Sosik, one of the primary investigators on the Ocean Twilight Zone project, going down into the twilight zone. And it's a really cool way to be able to see and to study, but there aren't a lot of submersibles like this around. They're still kind of limited in how long you can stay down there for. And so the team at WHOI has really come up with a lot of different ways that we can get down or get instruments down into the twilight zone to be able to help collect data for us. These two instruments right here, this is called the Stingray and this is called the Deep Sea, and these are towed behind the boat. They are equipped with all kinds of sensors so that we can sample the water. They have all kinds of cameras on them as well so that we can collect images and see what's down at depth. And they can stay down a lot deeper than or stay down deeper for a longer period of time than a lot of submersibles can. So this image right here is an example of the kind of picture that we get back from the Stingray. So it has a special camera on it called ISIS that takes really detailed pictures of the gelatinous animals that live down there, for example. The Deep Sea has imaging systems on it as well, but it also kind of captures images in a different way. So kind of like a bat or a whale, it uses sound. So it'll send a sound signal out that bounces off of objects that are in the twilight zone, and that sound will come back to the deep sea, and it can process that and figure out what exactly is out in the water. Now, I think probably the coolest robot that has been developed as a part of this Ocean Twilight Zone project is this kind of odd looking robot. This is called the Misobot, and this is a completely autonomous robot. So the other instruments I was telling you about still rely on a ship to tow those instruments through the water, but this can operate completely on its own, completely untethered. And I think probably the neatest thing about it is that it can find a single individual animal, and it can follow that animal for hours or potentially even days. And so it might be able to find a jellyfish that is participating in this diel vertical migration, that going up in the water column and down, and it might be able to follow it that entire time. So I think this is a super cool instrument. And before we talk about why you should care about the ocean twilight zone and how it affects us, I'll take questions.
Okay, this is Grace in the chat box. We have a couple of questions. I always love seeing those different, especially the Misobot. So this is an interesting question that came in from Jennifer. And Jennifer is wondering, do you color your submersibles red so that they disappear in the ocean twilight zone and so they don't disturb the animals?
That's a really good question, and I have to admit that I am not an engineer and I don't design these, so I don't know the answer to that one.
So I encourage you, if you ask that question, to take a look. You can go to the WHOI website and take a look at the color and see if they are red. I think, now that I think about it, I think that I've seen other colors other than red. So I
Yeah,
encourage you to go look. Yeah.
I mean, the Misobot is actually a yellow robot. And so I know that a lot of the lights that they use on it are lights to minimize disturbance, but I don't know that the color of the instruments is really too important.
Interesting. And Mylon wonders, can the Misobot follow any creature? Like, does the person control that and decide, or does it, just start following a creature?
Sure. So that is something that is really unique about the Misobot, is that it's not controlled by people. So when it's down in the twilight zone operating autonomously, it's choosing what it's going to follow.
And is that something that's then programmed in, or how does it decide what to follow?
That would be a good question to go to the website and find out a little bit more information.
Excellent. And we'll put a link, because I'm intrigued. We'll put a link to the Misobot on our NOAA Live website, because I think there's a lot to be learned about the Misobot. It's very cool. And you said it was designed at WHOI, is that correct? Specifically for this project?
Yeah, that's right. So it was designed at WHOI with collaborators from other institutions as well, specifically for the Twilight Zone project. And so was Deep Sea.
And one last question, and again, I know that the submersibles aren't your area of expertise, so we're really stretching you to your limit, Lindsey. I appreciate this. This question comes from Tyler. When you tow a submersible, how do you make sure it goes to the depth that you want to explore?
That's great. So there are a lot of sensors that are located on the instrument, and all of those are also connected back to the ship. So we can see what depth it's at and have a little bit of control over where, where we're putting it into the water and how deep we're putting it.
Got you. Awesome. All right. I want to know why this is important to us. I know you're going to share that with us. So I'm going to turn it back to you and have you continue on, Lindsey.
All right. Sounds good. So hopefully so far today, you've learned a little bit about the Twilight Zone and been introduced to some pretty amazing critters that might seem kind of weird, but are really perfectly adapted to where they live. And so what we haven't talked about yet is how the Twilight Zone is affecting all of us right now. And one thing is that the Twilight Zone is really an important link in the Oceanic Food Web. So the animals that live here in the Twilight Zone are connected to both the surface as well as deeper water. So the animals that live here will migrate up into the surface waters and eat some of the plants and animals that live up here. Animals that live in the surface, like we mentioned before, like sperm whales, will dive down there. Also some penguins and dolphins and sea turtles dive down there and eat Twilight Zone animals. And then frankly, when the Twilight Zone animals poop or when they die, all of that also drifts down to the deep sea and can be part of the food web for the deeper ocean as well. Now, you might not have a Twilight Zone fish served to you on a plate directly, but a lot of the animals that people like to eat, like this swordfish up here, or this tuna down here, or even squid, depend on Twilight Zone animals as a part of their diet. Also, this image right here shows a net pen with amberjack. So aquaculture or fish farming is kind of an important source of of fish protein. And the Twilight Zone is being looked to as a place to potentially harvest animals and other fish to produce fish meal, to produce fish food for these aquaculture pens. So it might be, like I said, well, you aren't necessarily going to be served this fang tooth on a plate, you might already kind of be indirectly eating Twilight Zone animals. Now, one of the ways that we're really trying to understand exactly how important and the magnitude of the importance of the Twilight Zone is in how it helps keep our planet cool. So carbon dioxide from the atmosphere gets absorbed into the surface waters, and kind of like the rainforests on land absorb a bunch of CO2 and turn that into carbon that can be used and store the carbon as well. Phytoplankton, through photosynthesis, like Grace mentioned earlier, they take carbon dioxide, they use sunlight, and they turn that into something that a source of carbon that can be used and is a source of energy for animals throughout the food web. And the animals of the Twilight Zone, through this diel vertical migration, are connecting the surface waters with deeper waters. So as they go up and eat, they're taking that carbon down to depth with them, they're excreting it, they're pooping it, and that poop is sinking really far down where it can sequester the carbon, it can hold the carbon for centuries and sometimes even thousands of years. And that way, the surface waters have more space and have the ability to absorb more carbon dioxide. And we call this the biological carbon pump. And so we're really trying to figure out the role that the Ocean Twilight Zone plays in that and helping keep our planet cool. So I'm going to leave off there today. The Twilight Zone is really this amazing world and this mysterious world that is right here on our planet. And while a lot of us won't ever get the chance to go down there ourselves, or maybe not even see the animals that live there, it really is important to all of us here. So if you want to follow along with the discoveries that scientists at WHOI are making, you can go to the NOAA Live webpage, and there are a bunch of links that will take you to websites where you can discover more. You can find out more facts about these animals, learn even more about the ways that we study the Twilight Zone. And there's a really fun quiz too. If you go to keepitweird.org, you can go and figure out which Ocean Twilight Zone animal you're most like. So with that, thank you very much for having me come here today and tell you about this really exciting and interesting work that's going on.
Excellent. I know I learned a lot, and I'm not sure if this is complimentary or not, but when I took the quiz, I think I was most like the fang tooth. I'm not sure what that says about me, but it's very fun. That link is on the NOAA Live website as well if you want to take it and find out what mysterious creature you're most like. It's really fun to take. We have time for just a few more questions, Lindsey, if you're okay. I'll
Sure.
give you a few more. So let's see. Do mysticetes, so mysticetes are our baleen filter feeding whales. Do they go down into the Twilight Zone to find food?
That's a great question to look up. The whales that I can think of are odontocetes, but yeah, so I can only think of odontocetes, but I'm not sure. I know baleen whales can dive pretty deep too, but I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either. The one I think of normally going to the area is a sperm whale, which has teeth.
Yeah.
So I encourage you, if that was your question, to look it up. And I think the really fun thing about this is as much information as you're giving us, you're inspiring us to ask so many questions that we're thinking about new things we want to learn as well, which I always take as a good sign that we're all learning. Okay, another question came in from Jackie. Can Twilight Zone animals live in aquariums, or does the change in pressure damage them?
That's a really good question too. So a lot of the Twilight Zone animals, a lot of them would be damaged by the pressure change coming up to the surface, but you aren't ever going to be able to see them in aquariums. They aren't something that can survive in aquariums.
So I guess that's why it was so special that you showed us a lot of those things that we wouldn't normally be able to see in the aquarium. You know, I'm just cautious of the time, and I see that we're already at about 4:55, so I am going to stop us there. But Lindsey, I just want to thank you. That was fantastic. I learned a lot about the ocean twilight zone and the animals. I got to see my favorite animal. I got to bring some of our viewers that have been with us through most of the school year to WHOI, which is very exciting to bring them sort of to my hometown. So thanks so much for being our expert today. It was really great. Thank you again to our interpreters, Trisha and Crystal. We really appreciate it. And just for anyone who's still on that's been one of our loyal viewers, thank you so much for learning with us. It's been a great experience. We've enjoyed having you on our webinars. I encourage you, if this was your first one, to go take a look. We have lots of different topics. You can listen to or watch some of our other ones, depending on what you're interested in. Pick the one that piques your interest, but don't forget to visit our website if you want to know more about what we learned today, get a NOAA Live patch, or see some of the other webinars that we've offered. Thanks so much. Have a great summer. Have a great night. And we will hopefully see you as we explore the ocean in other ways.